thank you for taking the time, and I
My
feel
pleasure.
I really feel that I have to be completely upfront with you right off the top because Yes is my favorite band, and you, sir, are my favorite keyboard player that has passed through the band over so many years. And I really feel like, normally when I do an interview, I've always, and I've been interviewed Billy and John Davison and Jeff many times, and I'm always quite cool about it, but I really felt it was important for you to know that you, sir, are my favorite.
Well, that is very nice to hear. I don't hear that a lot.
Well, I've known Jeff now for oh gosh, it seems like a decade, and I met you obviously, a sea of faces when you were on the 50th anniversary tour, but I felt very lucky because I met you at one of the meet and greets, and you were sitting beside Jeff, and hand on heart, my two favorite Yes keyboard players throughout the entire history of the band are Tony Kaye and Jeff Downs. So that evening in
Well,
particular was a treat.
well, I love Jeff, and we got on so well on that tour. But of course, the Cape Crusader has always been a sort of a competition
Yeah.
for a lot of people in my life. So it
It's
has been
two very, very, very distinct and very different styles. But
a little bit,
yeah.
yeah.
But so let me ask you, more than 50 years in the music business, and you're finally releasing your first solo album. Did you ever have an inclination before to do something on your own, or was it this particular piece of music that made you sort of stop and be ready to go out on your own finally after all these years?
Well, certainly, looking back on what this particular piece of music has meant, I would say probably yes. I had to have a reason to actually write instrumental music, and it hadn't occurred.
Right.
I mean, let's face it, Dark Side of the Moon had been recorded.
Right.
What else? What else can you do? Right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. So, short of Six Wives of Henry VIII, which, you know, well, it was a pretty good idea, but it wasn't that appealing to me. Yes, I couldn't, and then that day happened in 2001, and of course, I had been retired for quite a few years. My keyboards were in flight cases in the garage.
Right.
And it just woke something up in me. I got inspired, just by the visuals and the emotion of what was happening that day, and I just had to write. I just had to record.
I wanted to ask you about a little bit of the backstory that led to End of Innocence, because I think part of its story and part of your story is like you said, you had essentially retired from the music business in I guess 1995 following the Talk Tour. What now? At the time, I seem to recall, and I don't know if this was accurate or not, that you had contemplated like going into managing Yes or something like that. Is that accurate? Once you decided to not be an active member anymore?
Well, it was a little bit of a strange situation, but after that tour ended, really, different members of the band were going different places.
Right.
And but it just happened that Chris and I were neighbors in the Hollywood Hills, and we saw quite a lot of each other, and he, in typical Chris manner, came up with this ridiculous idea of having someone that he could actually trust managing the band.
Right, makes a lot of sense.
Which was probably a really good idea. But of course, it was never gonna happen. And then Steve came back in the band, and the whole thing kind of changed. And
right.
I think probably sort of left the confines of Hollywood and went back to London.
Huh.
And a whole new dynamic happened.
Did you think of, in that ensuing time between when you retired from music and then the events of 9/11 that would eventually sort of inspired you to pick up your keyboards again, as it were? Did you think about music a lot? Did you miss the sitting down at the piano? I don't know. I mean, did you ever sort of sit down in front of a piano, or when you were? Sorry, go ahead.
I was glad to leave it behind. It had been a long time coming. I'd been on the road for a long time, and actually that last tour really pointed out in a very strong way that besides that, I didn't really have anything else. I didn't have a family. I didn't have a wife, girlfriend. I'd just been this guy on the road.
Right.
And I really started thinking about, what it was all about, and reaching probably an age where I was wanting something different.
Huh.
It was really as simple as that. I had no intentions of going on the road again, and I didn't really know what to do. So yes, it was a great change for me, and I played tennis and enjoyed myself.
I always feel tennis comes up when it comes to Tony Kaye, and I imagine you were quite the player.
Well, it was definitely one of my loves, and I did really get into competitive tennis.
Wow.
During the 80s and 90s. So yes, it was not so much competitively then, but certainly in the 80s and 90s, I played tournaments and
amazing.
Hung out with the pro tennis players, and went to their tournaments and whatnot, and of course they were all rock and roll crazy,
right?
Especially the 80s with McEnroe and Garlitis and Brad Gilbert and all of those guys were
right.
Sort of rock
they were rock stars themselves. The Jimmy Connors and the Andre Agassi's were their own sort of rock stars.
Yeah. So I mean, luckily I was able to kind of hang out with them and go to their tournaments, and we set up the Make-A-Wish Foundation tennis rock thing, which was a very cool, worthwhile thing with McEnroe and Vitas, and it was great, and played, and then had to put a band together for the last night. So
that's fantastic. So music was sort of maybe in the background a little bit, but never,
very much in the back, yes, and until of course 9/11 happened.
Right. And so were you? I think we all remember where we were when the events of 9/11 occurred. Were you in London at that time? And you know, tell me.
No, I was at my house in Los Angeles.
Okay. And
And
tell me about that day for you. What you remember and how you felt.
well, a friend who lived in D.C. who was in the political thing phoned me and kind of told me there was something going on, and I put on the TV, and there it was, and sort of glued to the TV all day.
And did you go to your?
Kind of well.
Sorry, go ahead. I was going to say, did you go to your keyboards that very day?
I had no keyboards.
Oh, okay.
I had no keyboards set up. They were all in flat cases in the garage.
Okay.
So I do remember it was a very hot day, and I went into the garage and unpacked the keyboards and used the flat cases as stands and plugged them in to an 8-track cassette recorder and just started playing. And actually, maybe two or three of the more orchestral tracks on the album actually came from that day.
Wow. You know,
the first day.
And you know, because you mentioned that, I really find it interesting. You know, I do my best to sort of be well versed in your history and in Yes history to a certain extent. And what I find really interesting and inspiring about this album, from kind of like a musical standpoint, is, you know, you were sort of viewed as this kind of traditionalist during your time in Yes, you know, especially sort of on those first 3 albums where you're this amazing Hammond organ player, and then, you know, and history and fans know as history went, Rick comes in and he's sort of more like, you know, surrounded by like these very all these different keyboards and different sounds. But yet, your first solo album, where if the perception, at least back in those days, is that you were sort of the traditionalist, I find it very interesting that, you know, what you've done here is you're running the gamut of keyboard sounds. It's not, you know, it's various.
Mm-hmm.
Is that idea of you as the traditionalist? Is that correct? And were you know, did you eventually find yourself gravitating towards other sounds? You know, I'm curious about how your sound kind of developed, because I think it's what you've done here is
Well,
sorry, go ahead.
You know, it is true. In those early days, the beginnings of Mini Moog and Mellotron, I was not interested in it. I was a very traditional Hammond piano player. I thought those instruments sounded horrible and they were out of tune. So I actually avoided them. And but it is certainly something that Yes wanted, which is, you know, why Rick came in. But you know, as keyboard technology progressed by the 80s and mid-80s, you know, of course, I got into different keyboards,
right.
90125 and subsequent albums. So, you know, it's just that basically the keyboard technology became, you know, better to play.
Right.
And not a huge fan, but you know, I mean, I played a lot of analog keyboards back then, and of course the DX7 and electric pianos, and you know, I like all of those sounds, and I mean, you are correct. This album has a lot of different sounds on it.
I want
really got.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, carry on.
I was gonna, I'm curious, like, and because basically, other than sort of, pretending that I can play a couple chords of Doors songs on the keyboard, I'm not well versed in keyboard playing. But when you're, and I've always thought of you as a very instinctual keyboard player. I think about that those Hammond sounds on those early Yes albums, and even on Talk, there's so much great Hammond organ playing that you deliver on there. And I've always thought of you as very much about feel rather than how many notes you can play. And I really think, at least as I'm listening to End of Innocence, I feel that's there as well. It's not a I don't ever think that you're showing off. I feel that everything that you're doing is there to sort of serve the song. And I'm wondering if, when you started composing this music, was it something where you could just kind of sort of sat down, closed your eyes, and just kind of let it come through you? I'm really curious about the process that you went through to write this music.
Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that, and I'm never really one for technical sort of show off. There is a classical piano piece on the album that I really enjoyed playing. But yes, I think you could say mostly it is sort of understated in a lot of ways, and in fact, with all the Hammond stuff that is on there, I really wanted it to be understated. Mm-hmm. I wanted that big Hammond sound that I loved, but I didn't want it to be virtuoso.
Right.
There's a couple of tracks, where I sort of emulated Graham Bond and Jimmy McGriff, and where the Hammond is much more sort of jazz oriented and a little more distinct, and of course I don't know whether you remember, but the one track 285 Fulton Street,
right, yes,
is an homage to the Graham Bond organization. He was really my first inspiration, and I sort of subconsciously, I think, to try to do an homage to that band. With the bass and all the weird stuff, and the Ginger Baker drums and
right.
everything.
Upon my first listen to it, and I hope you take this as a compliment, because this is meant as a compliment. The first sort of music that I thought, it kind of has a vibe to it, was I don't know if you ever listened to the Blade Runner soundtrack that Vangelis did back in the early 80s, but it's kind of it's a go-to piece for me. It's a go-to album, and when I was listening to End of the Innocence, I thought it had that sort of flow of different styles and different sounds, but yet nothing ever feels out of place. It feels like you managed to find a way to whether it's with the sounds that are coming from the keyboards or the tempos, and everything just sort of kind of seamlessly melds together. And I was wondering, when you were doing the sequence for the entire album, did you have the concept that that you'd written individual pieces and that they sort of, you found a place to put them? Or did you sort of, did you have the concept for a song that, for instance, I'm going to write about Flight 11, and then you proceed to create the song? What was that process like?
Well, you're talking about my favorite album of all time.
Oh, good. It's a compliment, then, please.
The Mendel album. Yeah, he was a great influence on me, and that album is exactly how you describe. Probably, my biggest influence on this album.
Wow.
And it is true, the sequencing. Although I actually wrote the individual things. The sequencing never changed in all these years.
Wow.
Very little, maybe a little, because I did add stuff. But actually, the sequencing has been in place for a long time, and the music really is set to a specific part of that day.
Right.
So, and of course, Vangelis was just the best.
Yeah.
That album is the best.
Yeah, that is it's a regular go-to for me, and because I find that you can either engage with it, and sort of be an active listener and sort of, have it sort of wash over you, but then at the same time you can also, you can put it on and go about your day, and it fills the room and it fills the space. It's sort of like you can take whatever you want from it, and quite honestly, I've found that, having listened to End of Innocence, more than a couple times now, there have been times where I'm sort of fully engaged with it, but then at the same time, if the same sort of thing as the Blade Runner soundtrack, where I'm going about my day and it kind of just, it fills my space. And so, job well done on that, because I think you can take it.
Thank you. It is actually supposed to be listened to as an entire piece.
Yeah.
Albums some albums in the past have been labeled concept albums. This is it's not a concept album because of what it was.
Yeah.
It was not. You couldn't make it up.
Yeah. No, not at all.
It was what it was. So yes, it is really supposed to be more in a sort of a classical sense, where you listen to, kind of like the planets, and you listen to the whole thing, and it only really makes sense if you do listen to the whole thing.
Yeah, I feel it. I absolutely feel it as I'm listening to it. Tell me about working with your wife on the album. She's the first, very few voices, but she's the first voice that we hear singing Twinkle Twinkle, and then she sings again on Sweetest Dreams. Tell me how I know she's a singer, but tell me how she became involved, or how you involved her in the project.
Well, I met her 2 weeks after 9/11.
Wow.
Yeah, and we started while I was writing this music. We got involved in her songwriting too, and one day, it was a little after Christmas, I think, that I asked her to write a song for the album, and she basically, wrote Sweetest Dreams for the first responder firefighters, after the buildings came down,
right,
and portraying what they went through. And it was such a beautiful song that it just stayed. The actual recording of that was the recording that I did on an 8-track cassette.
Oh wow!
And has never changed. And through all this time, and through the mixing of the album, I couldn't change it. It was already mixed from 20 years ago.
Right. Wow. So
from a cassette.
you mentioned it a couple times now, and it's interesting because this album has been a long time coming, because there is, on the internet, there's the Where Are They Now Yes site that a fellow named Henry Potts runs, and I remember reading years ago that you had mentioned that you were working on this album. So starting from obviously the 9/11 in 2001 up to now, it's been 20 years. I was actually curious, how long has it been completed for, and has it been, have you been sort of waiting to get it out till an appropriate time, or was this something that you just sort of kept working on until you finally thought, okay, well, this is now done?
Yeah, I mean, it was, I think 42 minutes or something when I got my hands on iMovie and decided to put it to visuals.
Right.
And so I spent a little time learning iMovie and put it to the visuals on that video, and went on YouTube and kind of stayed there for a few years. And I didn't really do that much for quite a long time. I did little bits, but it sort of stayed at around, I don't know, 50 minutes. And then of course I moved from LA to Florida.
Right.
And almost immediately COVID happened, and I was locked in my house.
And
what else was I going to do?
I was going to say, I'd rather you just lock yourself in your house and finish and keep working on it.
Yeah, really. And I set up a couple of keyboards. I had a couple of Roland keyboards. I had my Roland Hammond sound-alike, and just kind of finished it, really. And of course, by this time, I had been on the Cruise to the Edge with Yes, and of course the 50th anniversary, and got involved with Yes management, and they heard it. And they said, we'd like to release it, and it's now coming up to the 20th anniversary. Can you finish it? And simple as that, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's a sad time to mark, and yet it's a very beautiful album to mark it with. So I'm glad that it's going to be out there.
Well, thank you. I'm happy you got it. It's very rewarding to me to because obviously it's a very different album.
For sure.
It's not your normal rock prog instrumental album.
Yeah.
And
no, it's wonderful.
It's inspirational.
It's wonderful. I know I have to let you go in a minute, but before I do, I'm hoping I can get you on. There are two sort of happier anniversaries in some ways, and one is this year marked the 50th anniversary of the Yes album, and I'm curious, what is your favorite song off of that classic album that you got to play on?
Well, it has such great memories, the whole thing. I was very involved, of course, with writing with Steve, Yours Is No Disgrace. And, so in a way, that is probably my favorite thing. And, of course, at the time, Steve and I were although I didn't really get onto much of any of the rest of the album, but we did hang out a lot, and it was great actually. A couple of years ago, getting to know him again, because I hadn't seen him in such a long time. So probably yours is no disgrace, I think.
It's such a you were.
Or as Bill Russo calls it, your nose is a disgrace.
Well, it was so great seeing you on the 50th play. That it was amazing. And one last question, because my biggest regret as a music fan and as a Yes fan is I was 14 years old when the Union tour happened, and I was not allowed to go. My mother would not allow me to go to concerts on weeknights, and I had not yet become a Yes fan when the Union tour came to Toronto, so I did not get to see it. It is by far my biggest regret as a music fan. But I watched over and over the Yes Years VHS tape that came out at the time, and it seemed like you, most of the guys, I know like there was, some issues here and there, but it seemed like most of the guys had a good time. It seemed like you and Rick really did hit it off. How do you look back on the Union tour 30 years later?
Well, yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, apart from a couple of guitar issues,
yeah.
It was a surprise how successful it was. For one thing, it was in the round. We were all together. The fans just loved it, and everyone was getting on really well. Rick and I were just having a ball, and he was doing his thing, I was doing mine, and we were both digging it. So it really was a good time.